So, hello everybody. Uh, my name is Asís. I'm originally from Honduras, or you might pronounce it Honduras. Remember that in Spanish we don't pronounce H is silent, so I would say Honduras. Uh, I want to start saying that Spark teachers love making connections, and I see many connections between Amar's and Keith's presentation. So my presentation is about Gramsci and the politics of education, and then Escola Nacional Florestan Fernandes, which is in Portuguese, it means Florestan Fernandes National School. It's based in Brazil, Sao Paulo. So how is this thing of Gramsci related to my teaching and my experience in Brattleboro, Vermont? So I'm going to talk about this. Gramsci. Let's begin with some background information about Gramsci. Gramsci was I would say, was from Italian communist. He was one of the, he along with others founded the communist Italian party in the 1900s, almost 100 years ago. And he got involved in the workers' movement early in his 20s. But interesting about Gramsci is that most of his intellectual work was done while he was in prison. And it's during that time when Mussolini, which is connected to the era of fascism around the world, and specifically in Europe. So he organized against Mussolini by the time, and he was in prison almost 10 years. So most of his work was done by he was in prison, and he didn't. Late in the 60s, 70s, his work was published, called Prison Notebooks or Quaderni del Carcere. He didn't call it like that, but because of all of his work was done in prison, so I think people decided to call it Prison Notebooks. So why Gramsci, and how is that related to my teaching experience, and how I see myself as an educator, as a teacher? So most of my teaching experience has been based in Honduras and not in the U.S. So it's my first time also having a teaching experience in the U.S., in specific here in Vermont. I decided to do a whole year getting certified in social studies high school, and this is my mentor teacher, Henry. So Gramsci for this is very important because my early experience in Honduras through doing basically some kind of political education, working with youth. My experience in Honduras has been not directly related to formal education, meaning working in schools, teaching, but working, organizing workshops and going to high schools and to talk about economic issues, social issues, political issues in school. And so my experience has been working with youth, high school students. And in my early 20s, I had my first, I would say my first intellectual contact with Gramsci's work around, Gramsci talks a lot about the role of schools, the role of education in society. So that's why it's very relevant for me. So Gramsci died in 1937. He got very ill after being in prison for almost 10 years. The first the first 2 years, Mussolini denied him to read, to have books, and also to write. So until the third year, he started to write his work. And then during the 40s, 50s, his work was kind of like prohibited. So until the 60s, you can see the first like a publication around his work. So Gramsci developed a kind of theory to analyze society, looking society as a kind of cultural organization. And so that's why also it's really important for educators, teachers to read Gramsci, how in the way how he frames the role of education. So there are certain key concepts, categories that he uses to analyze society and specific the culture. For example, common sense, or sometimes he call it folklore. Common sense for Gramsci is very important because in the way that he says that common sense is a kind of conceptions of the world that everyone has, and also it said that tend to be in contradiction with another, and therefore for an incoherent whole. And also he said that we have this common sense, and it's really complex because it has a lot of truth, it's based on truth, but also in a lot of misconceptions about society. So that's, for example, one concept that he uses a lot to analyze society. Another one that he uses is civil society. I don't know if it's, have you ever heard about this term? So he uses a lot, and it's really important when it comes to analyze the role of schools and education, because he tried to distinguish between a political society and a civil society, meaning political society, the ruling class, or the elite, the class who owns most of the means of productions, or who is in power, and civil society meaning institutions or voluntary organizations that are not part of government, are not part of the judiciary system, or are not part of the repressive institutions such as police and military. So this concept is very important because it means that we can frame schools and education as political, because schools are not part of civil society. From the perspective of Gramsci, a school has a function, and therefore if there is a ruling class, a school more likely will reproduce a dominant narrative about political issues, about social issues, about economical issues. So that's why this concept is key to understand Gramsci, because I can argue that schools are political. When others, teachers and educators, says that schools are like neutral. I personally, based on from like a Gramsci perspective, I believe that schools and education are political, and we can see through history who get to decide what content to teach. Even though now school, we can see the language is changing. For example, we use a lot this terminology of creating critical thinking in students, but when it comes to certain topics, things get really critical in the schools, and we can. And I saw this through my year in school. Like, for example, gun violence. For example, Black Lives Matter. Were like topics or things that when we came to decide how to explore in school, it wasn't easy. It's still not easy. So for me, that's an example of how schools are playing a certain specific role in society. Another term that is for me important, and also is one of his big contribution to political theory is this big word hegemony. So he talks a lot about hegemony, and meaning that he said that hegemony, of course, is part of the economic system, but at the same time, he believes that it's not enough to analyze only who owns the means of production. He said that also, in order to a ruling class to be in power, there has to be a system of belief that people have to believe unconsciously or consciously in order the system to keep functioning. So that's why Gramsci said that it's important to analyze how the role of a school, the role of educators, what is the common sense, how we legitimize the ideas of how we reproduce, for example, in schools, dominant narrative, or like what Takaki calls the master narrative about history, for example. So that's why, from Gramsci perspective, it's really important to analyze the role of culture, and in specific the role of educators. If from Gramsci perspective, schools are also political. I'm not gonna read that. Another thing that is really important, I'm just pulling out some concepts or categories from Gramsci's work. There are a lot to explore, but the role of intellectuals. It's really interesting that he tries to distinguish between two categories. He talks about an organic intellectual and a traditional intellectual. So what is this of organic intellectual? He says that organic intellectuals are those who emerge from out of the group itself. For example, a worker who becomes a political activist, an organizer, could be perfectly organic intellectual. And a traditional intellectual are those who are not specifically organizing. It's more like this idea of writers or professors that are not specifically engaged in political work or organizing. So for Gramsci, it's really important to understand that if, for example, educators believe in the society in which in the society in which is based on economic and social justice, that we have to create organic intellectuals. And these organic intellectuals has to come, for example, from the working class, for example. So that's why the role of education is very important from the perspective of Gramsci, and not only the formal education, also political education. Another term that he uses and he made a big contribution is about the philosophy of praxis. For Gramsci, philosophy of praxis is both theory of contradictions in society and at the same time people's practical awareness of those contradictions. In other words, when people is conscious of the reality and is able to make connections, make historical connections, and decide to do something, to take actions to change their reality. Therefore, he see a process of philosophy of praxis. So philosophy of praxis is being able to reflect in your reality, at the same time being able to do something, to take actions. And then